So we've created the DAO. So we're still looking at the lower part of this entire architecture here, structure. So now we are going to instantiate or create the actual class that will implement, or rather the abstract class in this case, that will be implementing our room database. But there is such room database class that is out there, which will allow us to then create the database, or at least set up the database entities and all the things that we need. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's get rid of that for now, favorite as well, and this too. So let's go back to our project, and it's still inside of our data here. I'm going to create a new file, Kotlin file. This is going to be an abstract class, but I don't have access to an abstract class, I don't think, here. So it's okay. I'm just going to use the interface. I'm going to change that. So let's call this weather database as such. And as I said, it's going to be an abstract class. So I'm going to change that right away from here. And in this case here, and so this, what it does, well, first of all, this will, so this weather data, so our database here, it's going to inherit from room database. Because room database, of course, is the class that has all the things that we need in order to create the actual, at least to set up the structure, the room database structure, right? This structure here, which is included around with everything. Okay. So we need to also make sure that the compiler will know what this is all about. So I'm going to say database like this. Remember, it's going to be Android X room database. And here is where we set up the skeleton of our database, which we will create in a bit. So in this case here, we need to pass the entities. Entities, again, are just tables. Notice it says entities and it's array or a list of entities, classes, right? Because in most databases, you usually have more than one entity. So that's why it allows us to pass a list. So I'm going to say entities, right? In this case, a list just put inside of square brackets like this, and we will have two tables, but for now we're just talking about one, which is favorites. So I'm going to say favorite, there we go, and I'm going to make sure that this is a class. That's what we are calling, right? That's what we are setting up. And then we need to pass the version of our database, so just a number, so 1 is fine, and I'm going to say export schema false like this. Okay, very good. So now we're saying whenever this is called, it's going to create an actual, it's going to have the entity, all the entities, all the information, all the metadata that will be needed to create those tables. In this case, just one table for now. All right. And because it's an abstract class, that means it also has to have abstract functions. In this case, we're just going to have one. This abstract function, it's going to be called weather DAO, which in this case is going to extend our weather DAO. So the idea is that this is going to be something that will need to be implemented at the class level when we call this function. So it's going to return a weather DAO, which is what we created earlier. And weather DAO will know how to access the database, the SQLite, meaning it will know how to CRUD or perform all the operations in our SQLite database. Very good. So that's what we're constructing here. So that's it for our weather database, right? So we created this structure. It's set up. Now we haven't created the database yet. How do we create a database? Now there are different ways. Now because we are using dependency injection here, we are going to still use dependent injection, which means we're going to use the class that we created earlier. If you go back to DI here, the app module, remember that this is where we earlier used for weather API. This is where we created this provider function per se that provides this weather API, which creates a retrofit instance that in this case, we pass the weather API class to do all the magic in the background. We don't need to really worry too much about, so that we are able to get data from the internet. So again, we're going to do the same thing here. Number one, we need a way for us to have a provider for our DAO, because our DAO, it's very important, as you will see, as I've illustrated here. The DAO is what allows us to access the data directly, which is encapsulated in our room database. So we need to provide that as well through our app module. So I'm going to say at, first of all, I'm going to make sure there's a singleton like that. And then it's going to be a provider. So it provides something, right? And I'm going to say fun, provide weather DAO. So this function here, first of all, is going to return a weather DAO type, right? And then I'm just going to go ahead and say weather DAO. But how do I get that weather DAO? Well, we need to pass around here, say weather. Actually, I need to pass a weather database, I should say. Right? We need a database type. And inside of this, put a new line. This is where I'm going to use our weather database and invoke the weather DAO to get the actual DAO. So all we're doing here, which is saying when we provide weather DAO is called, is just going to go ahead and get the DAO object, which incidentally will allow us to go around and get the data in our SQLite entities or tables. All right. Again, we're not going to be using this directly. This is for our dependency injection, as you will see later. Very good. And next here, what I'm going to do is we need to create or provide the actual database. This is where we create the actual database. So we created this skeleton of what needs all the metadata that it's needed to create the database. Now we need to create the actual database. And we're going to do all in our app module because that's the setup we have for dependency injection and so forth. Okay. So the same thing, add singleton. And then add provides like this. And then fun, provide, and notice the naming. It's very important. This is not random. So I'm using the provide and then say app database so that we know if we need to get back here, what's going on. All right. So this will return a weather DAO. So this will return a weather database, obviously. And I'm going to set it to something. But before I even set it to something, I need to pass a few things. You see, in order for us to instantiate a database, we need an application context. So an application context, just think of one of those classes that have access to everything in our project, in an Android project, right? As the name implies, a context. So it has context of everything from resources, from other classes around the realm, around the tree of everything that composes, everything that constructs an actual Android app. So we need that context in order to pass it around into our Room database builder, as you will see in a second. So how do we do that? Well, I can say at application context. This is beautiful because this comes from Hilt, Dagger Hilt. All right, and it's going to be a context, application context like this. Let's close this down so we have more space. So now this provide app database is going to provide a weather database. So what do we do? Well, this I'm going to say room. Look at that, room like this, dot database builder. Right. How do we build a database? Well, we need to pass the context. We've got that. Next, we need to pass the actual class that we need to model after in order to create the actual database, which is, yes, a weather database. Remember? And we're just going to get the class, the raw class per se. And we need to pass the name for our database. In this case, I'm going to call this weather database, like that. Just a string, could be anything. All right. We're not done yet, because then I'm going to go and invoke a few other functions. First of all, I'm going to call this fallback to destructive migration. It's just for migration stuff that we don't need to care about at this point. It's fine. And then I'm going to just call build to build, in this case, our database. Looks like a context is having a problem. That's because I'm passing an application context. I just have to pass the actual Android context like that. That's what's needed. There we go. And there you have it. So all of this is happening inside of our module. Remember, we're not going to directly invoke these functions there. This is for Hilt and Dagger and Hilt so that we can get all of these provided to us when we need them via injection, dependency injection. All right, so that's it, really. So now we've pretty much done with all of this. Right? We've created this DAO access data access object before. We created that one entity. There's one more we're going to create later, but that's fine. And we've created the structure of our room database, as you saw earlier, that weather database. And then we even were able to use the app module from our dependency injection with Dagger and Hilt to actually instantiate that database as well as our DAO, to have those singletons whenever we need them, as you will see in a second. So now we're going to move up and create, of course, a repository, because we need a repository that will connect to our DAO, reflect a DAO, so we can get that information, right? Get or update or delete to do the CRUD operations, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and do that, all right? We're creating a process here. So let's go back to our project. And what I'm going to do is inside of a repository, we already have this weather repository. This is for our other kind of data, right? But we're going to do something else now. In fact, if we wanted to do this, we could have put everything inside of this one repository, right? But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put in a different repository. But the whole idea is that a repository is the single source of truth for all app data. But just for simplicity, I'm going to separate the concerns a little bit and create a new repository inside of a repository package. Okay. So let's go ahead and say new. Call this weather DB repository. Like that. And because it's just a repository, notice we don't need to add anything in terms of annotation and so forth. However, what we're going to do, we need to inject, right? So what we need the DAO. So I'm going to say inject constructor. I'm going to put here our private val weather DAO, like this. Now, let's look at the picture again. That's exactly what we need, because this DAO is the one interface that allows us to access our SQLite. So we need to inject it in our repository in order to be able to do so. Injection, we're not recreating, or in this case, we are not instantiating a new object. We are injecting it. Ah, very cool. So now inside here, I can do all sorts of things, right? I can do what we want to do in this case, which is to mirror what we've done with DAO. If you remember correctly, in our DAO, we have all these functions. So we're going to mirror that. This is where we're actually going to get that information and so forth. So I'm going to say fun. Let's start with get favorites. And usually the names are similar, just to mirror everything. And it's going to be a flow. That's the types that we are going to wrap this around. Kotlin coroutines flow. Make sure that's it. A list of favorites object, like that. And I'm going to set that to what? Well, we're going to use weather DAO dot and get favorites. Look how convenient this is. So now when we use our weather DB repository, we know we have access to DAO, which is great because we need that. And so we create a function that returns a list of favorites wrapped into a flow, just a type, right? A sequential type, coroutine, and all that great stuff. And we call the weather DAO. Again, remember, we're accessing through our DAO. That's the whole objective, right? Data access object. Access object. Okay. Through our DAO, we get favorites. And done. Okay. We can continue here. I'm going to create another function. Let's say insert favorite. To insert a favorite, we need a favorite object, of course. And then I'm going to also use DAO, of course, and then insert that favorite object. I can just pass favorite like this. Let's see. Right, I need to make this suspend. There we go. All right, insert favorite, and pass that favorite. You get the gist. I'm going to suspend function. Let's say update favorite, which we're not going to use, but it's okay. We pass a favorite object we want to update, and then we call weather DAO.update favorite and pass that favorite. Look at that. Right, I can suspend again. Let's see. Say delete all favorites. In this case, I don't have to do much, but just saying weather DAO, delete all favorites, and there we go. Again, suspend function. Let's say I want to delete one favorite, which we're going to use actually. Delete favorite. We pass the favorite object I want to delete, and we call weather DAO, delete a favorite, and pass that favorite. And I can, just because, I can do the get fav by ID, which is going to be a city. Right, that's the ID, just a string. And I'm going to expect a favorite type. In this case, I'm going to set all of that to weather DAO.get by fav, or fav by ID, that is, and pass the city. And there you have it. So now, again, I think this helps. We've created the repository. So the next thing we need to do, it's going to be our view model, which in turn will have repository as its dependency, injection dependency there, so that we can then use repository and say get favorites, and going to return all the favorites, insert and pass favorite, and so forth. Okay, so as you see, this is a structure that is simpler to follow. I hope you can see how simple this is. And it's simpler to also digest, I think, once you put things into separate classes, into a cluster of classes, and you understand, okay, this level is this, and then you have this level, and that level, and that level. So this hierarchy, it's really important. So if you're a beginner and this may seem like, oh my gosh, this is just too much to bear. But remember, doing this, even though it takes a little bit of time, you have to think a little bit about things. But if you do like this, then you're doing it the right way. And that's what we want to do when it comes to software development. Okay, there we go. So now we're done with our weather repository. Next, we're getting close, ladies and gentlemen. Next, we are going to move on to view model, where we're going to deal with holding all the data needed for our user interface, in this case, our composables. We're getting there, and I'll see you next.